He had one bullet left, and he wasn't planning to use it on anyone else. Former U.S. Marshal Gideon Hale lay face down in Montana snow, 3 weeks starved, frostbitten to the bone, and completely done with the idea of surviving. The cold didn't even hurt anymore, which meant he was almost out of time. Then a woman's voice cut through the wind like a blade. "You planning to die there, or are you going to earn your place by my fire?" She didn't reach out a hand. She didn't move an inch. And somehow, that was the only thing that saved him. If this story finds you tonight, drop your city in the comments and hit that like button. Let's see how far this one travels. The snow had been falling for 3 days without stopping. It came down thick and sideways in the kind of Montana wind that didn't care what it buried. Trees, trails, animals, men. The kind of wind that made the whole world look the same, flat, white, and final. Gideon Hale had stopped fighting it somewhere around the second day. By the third morning, he wasn't sure he'd actually made the decision to stop, or if his body had simply made it for him. He was on his stomach in the snow, which wasn't how he'd fallen. He'd fallen on his side. He must have rolled at some point, or tried to get up and failed, because there he was, cheek pressed against ice, left arm twisted underneath him at an angle that would have hurt if he could still feel anything past his elbow. He was 37 years old. He had $16 in a coat pocket, a Colt revolver with 1 round left in the cylinder, and a reputation across 4 territories that hadn't done a single useful thing for him since October. October was when everything fell apart. He didn't think about October if he could help it. He thought about the snow instead, about how quiet it was. A man could do worse than go out quiet. His horse had thrown a shoe 4 days back and gone lame. He'd cut the animal loose rather than let it suffer alongside him. One decent decision in a string of bad ones. The nearest town, Calvers Creek, was either 15 miles north or 20 miles east, depending on which fork in the trail he'd taken 2 days ago in the dark. He hadn't been able to tell then. He definitely couldn't tell now. Gideon closed his eyes. He thought, without much feeling attached to it, that this was probably where it ended. Then he heard it. Not wind. Not the creak of frozen timber. Something else. The particular silence of a person standing still and watching. He'd spent enough years tracking men through wilderness to know that specific quality of stillness. Someone was close. He opened his eyes. 8 feet away, half obscured by a curtain of falling snow, a woman stood looking down at him. She was wearing a heavy wool coat the color of pine bark, a wide-brimmed hat with the front brim pinned up, and an expression he couldn't quite read from this angle. But it wasn't horror, and it wasn't pity, and those were the 2 things he might have expected. She had a rifle tucked under one arm, not pointed at him, not lowered either. "You alive?" she said. Her voice was flat and practical, like she was asking about weather. "Partially," Gideon said. His voice came out wrecked, cracked, and hoarse from cold and disuse. She studied him for a moment the way you might study a wagon wheel with a cracked spoke, assessing whether it was worth fixing or whether you should leave it on the road. "My fire's about 40 feet that direction." She tilted her head south without looking away from him. "You can get there or you can stay here. Up to you." She turned and walked back the way she'd come. Didn't offer a hand. Didn't come closer. Just turned and walked away through the snow like she had somewhere more important to be. Gideon stared at the place where she'd been standing. Every reasonable part of his brain told him that getting up was not a realistic option. His feet were blocks of ice. His left arm was numb to the shoulder. He'd eaten nothing in 2 days except a strip of frozen jerky, the approximate texture of boot leather. He was, by any honest accounting, already dying. He thought about October. He thought about the way it had felt, the specific, suffocating weight of knowing you'd made the wrong call at the wrong moment, and that other people had paid for it. He thought, maybe that's reason enough to stay here. Then some other part of him, some stubborn, ugly, inarticulate piece of him that he'd never been able to fully silence, said, "Crawl." So he did. It took him 11 minutes to cover 40 feet. He knew because he counted his own heartbeats somewhere around the halfway point, partly to measure distance, and partly because focusing on the count was the only way to keep his mind off the pain that came flooding back into his hands and feet as circulation fought its way through frozen tissue. It was the kind of pain that made a man see white even in the middle of a snowstorm. He made it to the fire. It was a good fire, low and well built, with a ring of stones and a cast iron pot hanging from a tripod over the coals. The smell coming off that pot hit him so hard he had to stop for a moment and grip the nearest stone to keep from passing out. Salt pork. Potatoes. Something with onion. The woman was crouched on the far side of the fire, feeding sticks into the base of the flame with economical precision. She glanced up when he dragged himself into the circle of heat, noted that he'd arrived, and went back to tending the fire. "Sit up if you can," she said. "Lying flat this close to open flame is how people catch." Gideon got himself upright. It took a while. He wasn't graceful about it. His left arm still wasn't fully cooperative, and his right knee hit the ground hard twice before he managed to get himself into something resembling a seated position. He made no attempt to pretend any of this was easy. The woman watched him without comment. "Eliza Hartwell," she said when he'd settled. She didn't reach across the fire to shake his hand, just gave her name, flat and straight, the way men did when they weren't sure if the other person was worth more than information. "Gideon Hale." Something crossed her face at that. Recognition, quick and quickly controlled. She looked at him again, more carefully this time. He'd seen that look before. His name got around. "The Marshal," she said. "Former." She accepted that without pressing it, pulled 2 tin cups from a canvas bag near her knee and ladled something into both from the pot, handed one across the fire. "Drink it slow," she said. "You throw it up, that's all you get." The broth was not particularly good. It was thin and oversalted, and the potato chunks were too soft and falling apart. It was the best thing Gideon had tasted in his life. He drank it slow. For a few minutes, there was nothing but the sound of wind and fire and the occasional crack from the frozen trees at the edge of the clearing. Gideon let the heat work its way back into his chest. His hands started to hurt worse as they thawed, which was unpleasant, but also, he understood, a good sign. "Where are you headed?" he finally asked. "Harlan's Fork." He thought about the map in his head, the one built from years of riding this country. "That's 40 miles west, railroad town. Building out. New hotel going up. Grand Continental, they're calling it." She said the name without admiration or mockery, just as a fact. "They're hiring a head chef." Gideon looked at the pot, at the carefully maintained fire, at the organized camp around them. Everything packed tight and practical, nothing wasted, everything in its place. "You cook?" "That's what I said. You came out here alone." "I did. In February." She looked at him across the fire with an expression that said she'd heard this line of questioning before and had decided a long time ago that she didn't owe it an answer. "In February," she confirmed. Gideon wrapped both hands around the cup and stared into it for a moment. He was still cold all the way through, the kind of cold that takes hours of heat to fully undo. But the shaking in his arms had eased slightly, and he could feel his feet again, which was both a relief and a misery. "Where are you headed?" she asked. It was a fair question. He didn't have a good answer. "Nowhere in particular." She poured herself more broth. Didn't offer him more yet, waiting, he understood, to see if he kept the first cup down. "You want work?" He looked at her. "I've got a wagon about a quarter-mile back," she said. "Horse pulled up lame this morning. Not bad, but she needs a day's rest and I can't give it to her. Trail's not safe solo in this weather, and I know it." She paused. "I'll feed you. You keep pace with the wagon and watch the perimeter. Harlan's Fork is 2, maybe 3 days west. And after that? After that's your problem." Gideon considered this. He had $16, a lame revolver, no horse, no particular destination, and a degree of survival debt that, if he was being honest with himself, was going to require at least 2 hot meals to properly begin to repay. "All right," he said. She nodded once, like she'd expected nothing else. "Sleep if you can. We move at first light." Well, the horse's name, it turned out, was Agnes, and she was a large gray mare with a Roman nose and a suspicious disposition towards strangers that Gideon found mildly offensive given the circumstances. Agnes tolerated him by the second morning, which Eliza said was faster than most people managed. "She doesn't like men much as a rule," Eliza said, the first morning, watching Gideon approach the mare slowly with one open hand and a piece of dried apple he'd found in the feed bag. "Most animals with sense don't," Gideon said. Eliza didn't laugh. He was getting the impression laughter wasn't something she deployed casually, but something shifted in her expression that might have been the beginning of it. The wagon was smaller than he'd imagined, a converted freight rig, canvas-topped, packed with careful efficiency. Dry goods in crates along the left wall, cooking equipment wrapped in cloth and secured with rope along the right, a bedroll and personal effects in a tight bundle near the front. Everything tied down, everything accounted for. The inside of it smelled like wood smoke and dried herbs and something sweeter underneath. Vanilla, maybe, or sugar. She'd been driving this rig alone for 11 days, she told him, when he asked. She'd come out of a town called Whitmore's Bend, 200 miles east, where she'd spent the previous 3 years cooking for a boarding house and saving every dollar she didn't need to spend. Boarding house cooking, Gideon said. He was walking alongside the wagon, matching Agnes's deliberate pace, scanning the tree line the way he'd been trained to do and had never managed to stop doing even after the badge came off. That's a long way from a grand hotel. It's cooking, she said from the wagon seat. The difference between a boarding house and a grand hotel is budget and clientele. The technique doesn't change. You tell the hotel that? I intend to show them. She said it without heat, not defiant, not nervous, just certain. The kind of certain that comes not from arrogance, but from a long time spent being good at something and knowing it. Gideon had met plenty of confident people in his life. Most of them wore their confidence like a costume, put it on in the morning, checked it in every reflective surface they passed. Eliza's confidence was more like the way she built a fire. It was just there, functional. Hers. He watched the trees and didn't say anything. They made 9 miles that first day, which was better than Gideon expected given Agnes's tentative gait on the packed snow. Eliza knew how to handle a horse. She kept Agnes to soft ground where she could find it, let the mare set her own pace on ice, stopped twice to check the leg and adjust the wrap she'd put on it. By afternoon, Agnes was moving more smoothly, picking her feet up with more confidence. "Where'd you learn to do that?" Gideon asked, watching Eliza rewrap the leg at the second stop. "My father had horses." She worked without looking up. He said if you want an animal to trust you, you have to be worth trusting. She said it simply, just a thing her father had told her, but it sat in the cold air between them with more weight than she'd probably intended. They made camp where the trail bent around a frozen creek bed, in a spot sheltered from the north wind by a rise of spruce. Eliza had her fire going in less time than it would have taken most men to gather the wood, and she had something proper going in the cast iron pot before the sky went fully dark. Salt pork again. But this time with dried beans and a handful of herbs she kept in small cloth pouches tied to the inside of the wagon canvas. "You carry spices on a frontier crossing," Gideon observed. "I carry what I need." "Most people packing light leave the herbs behind. Most people packing light don't know the difference they make." She stirred the pot. "When you've got nothing else, seasoning is the difference between eating and having a meal. It matters." Gideon sat on the opposite side of the fire and thought about that. "What happened to you?" she asked, without looking up from the pot. He didn't answer immediately. She didn't push, just kept stirring, steady and unhurried, like she had plenty of time and no particular attachment to the answer. "Made a bad call," he said finally. "What kind?" He looked at the fire. "The kind that got people killed." She was quiet for a moment, then, "How many?" "2 deputies. Good men." He paused. "Young." Eliza set the spoon across the pot and looked at him directly for the first time in several hours. Her face in the firelight was angular and serious, with the kind of bone structure that looked like it had been put together for function rather than decoration. Her eyes were dark and level. "You going somewhere to fix it?" she asked. "Can't fix it." "Then you going somewhere to answer for it?" "There's nothing to answer for, legally. I made a judgment call in the field, and it went wrong. That happens." "So what are you doing out here?" The honest answer was, trying to disappear. Trying to find a place cold enough and empty enough to stop feeling like himself. Trying to determine whether the weight of it was something he could put down or whether it was going to be on him the rest of his life. He said, trying to figure out what comes next. Eliza looked at him for a moment longer, not with judgment, but with the careful attention of someone who is deciding how much they believe. Then she picked up the spoon again. "That's a reasonable thing to be doing," she said. It was, he thought, the least dramatic response he'd ever gotten to that particular confession. Coming from Eliza Hartwell, he was beginning to understand that was high praise. The second day was harder. The temperature dropped overnight and the trail froze over completely by mid-morning, a surface like gray glass over the packed earth, treacherous for a horse with a tender leg. They went slower, stopped more often, and spent 40 minutes in the early afternoon extricating the wagon's rear wheel from a rut, where a patch of ice met a patch of mud. It was ugly work. Gideon got the wheel free by brute force and the careful application of a branch as a lever, and in the process went to one knee in the mud twice, soaked his left boot through, and said things about ice and wagon wheels that he wouldn't have said in polite company. Eliza, standing at Agnes's head to keep the mare steady while the wheel turned, said nothing about any of it. When the wheel was free and the wagon was moving again, she handed him a piece of hardtack from her coat pocket. "You swear at ice for long enough," she said. "It does eventually move." Gideon looked at her. She was looking at Agnes, but the corner of her mouth was doing something. "Was that a joke?" he said. "Eat your hardtack." He ate his hardtack. Late in the afternoon, they ran into trouble of a different kind. 3 men on horseback came up from the south, cutting across the trail ahead of them at maybe 200 yards. Gideon had seen them coming for 5 minutes before they reached the trail. The movement in the trees, the way the birds had gone quiet on the south flank. He drifted gradually to the left side of the wagon, putting himself between the approaching horses and Eliza's position on the seat. She'd noticed him move. He could tell by the way her hand shifted on the reins without any change in expression. The 3 men pulled up across the trail and waited. They were rough-looking, trail-worn, poorly outfitted for the cold, with the particular hollow-eyed look of men who'd been outside too long and eating too little. The one in the center, bigger than the other 2, had a rifle across his saddle, though the barrel wasn't raised. "Trail's blocked," the big one said. "I can see that," Eliza said from the seat. "Tolls. $1 each. There are no tolls on this trail." "There are now." He smiled. It wasn't a good smile. $1 each, or we take what covers it." Gideon had positioned himself about 6 feet off the wagon's left wheel, standing in the snow with his right hand resting on his thigh, close to the revolver at his hip. He was doing the math. 1 round in the cylinder, 3 men, 2 of whom were also visibly armed. The math was not great. But it wasn't just about the math. There was something about the way the man on the right was sitting, a certain looseness, like he wasn't fully committed to where this was going. The one on the left was harder looking, staring at the wagon with an expression that was less interested in the toll and more interested in what was inside it. Gideon looked at the man in the middle. "You want to think about the next 60 seconds, he said. His voice came out level and conversational. Not threatening, just serious in the way that sometimes, if you were lucky, got through to people before things went wrong. "I got 1 round. That's enough for the one who decides to move first. After that, it's close work, and I'm not in a condition that's going to end well for anybody." The big man's smile didn't change. 1 round doesn't do much for 3 problems. "No," Gideon agreed, "but you don't know which problem I pick first, and neither do your friends." He let that sit for a moment. "It's February. It's cold. Nobody here wants to bleed out in the snow over $1. The man on the right shifted in his saddle. The big man looked at him, then at Gideon, then at the wagon. Something moved behind his eyes, a calculation, a reassessment, some private debate between what he wanted to do and what he thought the likely outcome was. "Another time," he said. He turned his horse and rode south. The other 2 followed after a moment's hesitation, the left one throwing a look back over his shoulder that meant something. Not a retreat, not a surrender, just a temporary postponement. Gideon stood where he was until the sound of their horses faded. Eliza clicked her tongue, and Agnes moved forward, slow and careful on the ice. When Gideon had matched pace with the wagon again, she said, 1 round. 1 round, he confirmed. "And you were bluffing about the close work." "I was not bluffing about the close work. The close work would have been terrible. I was just honest about that." She looked at him for a moment from the wagon seat. "You were honest that it would go badly to convince them not to try it. Sometimes the most useful information you can give a man is an accurate picture of what he's about to step into." Eliza turned back to the trail, guiding Agnes around a slick patch near the shoulder. "You were a marshal for how long?" 12 years. "And before that?" Army, 4 years. She was quiet for a little while. The wagon creaked. Agnes's hooves made a muffled sound on the packed snow. Those men will be back, Eliza said. Or men like them. Yes. So what do we do about the round in your cylinder? I'd suggest we reload when we stop tonight. She reached into her coat and produced a paper cartridge and a small brass cap, offered them across to him without taking her eyes off the trail. He stared at them. You had ammunition, he said. I had 1 round to spare. I don't carry more than I need. She moved the hand slightly. Are you going to take it or not? He took it. You might have mentioned this before I started improvised hostage negotiation. You seem to be handling it, Eliza. What? Next time, please tell me you have ammunition. She considered this with great seriousness. I'll consider it, she said. That night, camped in a shallow draw out of the wind, she made cornbread in a small covered skillet buried in the coals, and it came out better than cornbread had any right to come out under those conditions. Dense and slightly sweet, with a crust on it that held together when you broke off a piece. Gideon ate 2 pieces and didn't say anything for a while. How do you do that? He finally said. Do what? Make food like this, out here, with what you've got. She was eating her own piece, picking at the edge of it with her thumb, the way people do when they've made something and they're checking it against their own standard. It's technique, she said, knowing heat, knowing what you've got to work with and what you can do with it. That's not all it is. She looked at him. It's care, he said. He wasn't sure where that came from. He said it anyway. You care about whether it comes out right. That's part of it. Eliza looked at the cornbread in her hand for a moment, then at the fire. Something moved through her expression. Not quite softness, but a kind of acknowledgement, like he'd said something accurate and she wasn't used to that. The hotel in Harlan's Fork, she said. They've had 4 candidates already. All of them trained in the East. Boston, Philadelphia, 1 from New York. She paused. I know what they think when they look at me. Gideon waited. They see a woman who cooked at a boarding house, she said. In a territory town. Nowhere near Boston. Her voice was level, but there was something underneath it. Not bitterness, exactly. Something older than bitterness. And they see a woman, period, which for some of them is the whole of the argument. But you went anyway. I went anyway. Why? She was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, it was without dramatics, without self-pity, without the kind of performance that comes when people are making a speech about their own bravery. Because I'm better, she said. I'm better than those Boston-trained candidates, and I know it, and the only way to prove it is to go. Staying home doesn't change anything. Gideon looked at the fire. He thought about what it meant to be certain of your own worth in the face of a world that had already decided what you were. He thought about the particular kind of courage it took. Not the loud kind, not the kind that got you in dime novels, but the slow, stubborn, daily kind that just kept moving in the direction you'd decided on, regardless of what came at it. They're going to underestimate you, he said. Yes. That might not be the worst thing. She looked at him. If they've already decided you can't win, he said, then everything you do that contradicts that is a surprise. And surprises change rooms. Eliza studied him for a long moment with that level, assessing look she'd turned on him the first night, checking the weight of a thing before she picked it up. You've thought about this kind of thing before, she said. I've walked into rooms where people had already decided what I was, he said. It happens in my line of work. Former line of work. Former line of work, he agreed. She handed him another piece of cornbread. He ate it and watched the fire and didn't think about October, which was the most he could say for any given evening lately. Eat. The third morning came in clear and brutally cold, the sky a flat white that made the light strange and directionless. Agnes was moving better, the leg holding, the limp barely noticeable, and by Gideon's reckoning, they had maybe 8 miles to Harlan's Fork. He'd been checking their back trail since dawn. The men from the day before hadn't followed, or if they had, they were staying out of sight, which amounted to the same thing for now. But something else had his attention. 2 sets of tracks cutting in from the north, running parallel to their trail about 50 yards east. Not following. Paralleling, which could mean they were heading the same direction, or could mean something else. He didn't say anything to Eliza until the tracks changed direction and began angling toward the trail ahead of them. "We've got company," he said. She looked where he was looking without drama. "The same men?" "Different horses. Heavier animals." He thought about the tracks, the depth of them, the stride length. 2 riders, moving fast. They both listened. Wind in the trees, Agnes's soft footfalls, the creak of the wagon. Then from ahead and left, the crack of a branch under a boot. Gideon was at the tree line before the sound finished echoing, moving at an angle that kept the wagon to his right and the noise to his left. He pushed through the first line of spruce and nearly walked into a man who was equally startled to see him. The man was young, maybe 20. He had a rifle, but it was slung over his shoulder and his hands were up before Gideon could say anything, which was a good sign. "Easy," the man said. His voice cracked slightly on the word. Behind him, further in the trees, a second man, younger still, perhaps 16, stood with his hands raised and an expression of pure terror. Gideon looked at them both, at the slung rifle, at the way they were dressed, thin coats, worn boots, no gear worth speaking of. "Where are you going?" he said. "Harlan's Fork," the older one said. "Same as you, I figure." "What's in Harlan's Fork?" "Work. We heard they're building out, railroad work, hotel work." He paused. "We're from Greeley's Hollow, 6 days east. Our farm's gone. We needed—" He stopped, swallowed. "We weren't going to rob you. I know how it looks." Gideon looked at the younger one, who hadn't spoken. The boy had the hollow-cheeked look of someone who'd been eating very little for several days and was trying not to show how scared he was. He stepped back out of the tree line. "Eliza," he called. She had the rifle out, which she lowered when she saw who was coming. "2 travelers," Gideon said, "heading the same direction." The older man came out of the trees first, hands still partially raised with the younger one close behind. Eliza looked at them both in the same methodical, unhurried assessment she applied to everything. "When did you last eat?" she said. The older man's jaw tightened. "Yesterday morning. Both of you, get up on the back of the wagon." She was already turning to get into the supplies. "There's not much, but there's enough." The young one, the boy, looked at Gideon with an expression that was too complicated to read all at once. Relief, humiliation, gratitude, and something that might have been the dawning understanding that not everyone in the world was trying to take something from you. Gideon put a hand briefly on the boy's shoulder as he passed. Nothing dramatic, just there. The boy nodded and climbed up onto the wagon. Tip-tip. They came into sight of Harlan's Fork in the late afternoon, a sprawl of raw lumber buildings along a central road with the skeletal iron framework of the Grand Continental Hotel rising above everything else like a promise or a threat, depending on your perspective. Smoke from a dozen chimneys, the distant sound of hammering, the smell of fresh sawdust and coal smoke on the cold air. Gideon stood at the edge of the last rise, looking down at the town. Behind him, Eliza sat on the wagon seat with her hands in her lap. He couldn't see her face from this angle, but he could imagine it. That same steady look, taking the measure of a thing she'd been heading toward for 11 days through cold and ice, and people who wanted to stop her. "There it is," he said. "There it is," she agreed. The 2 brothers, their names were Caleb and Martin Foss, climbed down from the wagon behind them and stood looking at the town with expressions of raw, unguarded hope that Gideon found difficult to look at directly. "Thank you," the older one, Caleb, said to Eliza. Then to Gideon, "Both of you." "Fine work," Eliza said, "and find somewhere decent to sleep before you go hungry again." She picked up the reins. Gideon fell in beside the wagon. They went down toward the town together, into the noise and light of Harlan's Fork, into whatever came next. He still didn't know what that was, not entirely. He didn't know if he was the kind of man who got to have a next, but he was moving toward it, which was different from 3 days ago in the snow. And he was warm, which was also different. He walked beside the wagon and watched the town come up to meet them, and he thought that arriving somewhere, even somewhere that wasn't yours yet, was still better than lying face down in the cold waiting for it to end. It was a start. It was, for now, enough. Harlan's Fork was the kind of town that had decided what it was going to be before it was fully built. The main road was still half mud, half frozen ruts, and half the buildings on it were raw lumber that hadn't been painted yet. But there was already a land office, a telegraph station, a proper hotel under construction, and 3 competing saloons, which in Gideon's experience meant a town had committed to existing. The railroad had come through 6 months prior and left behind a boom that the locals were still figuring out how to manage. Newcomers arrived daily, lumber arrived by the wagon load, money moved fast and not always cleanly. Gideon noticed all of this in the first 20 minutes, the way he noticed things, not by thinking about it exactly, but by absorbing it, the particular texture of a place, where the tension was and what it was about. Eliza noticed the Grand Continental Hotel. She stopped the wagon at the edge of the main road and looked at it the way a person looks at something they've been carrying in their head for a long time and are now seeing in actual dimension for the first time. The building was 2/3 finished, 3 stories of dressed stone and milled timber with iron hardware on the window frames and a facade that was clearly trying to say something about ambition. Workers were still on the upper scaffolding even in the fading afternoon light. "Bigger than I expected," she said. "That a problem?" "No." She said it simply and meant it. "It just means the kitchen will be worth having." She clucked at Agnes and moved the wagon forward. They found a livery at the north end of town run by a wide man named Dorsey, who charged reasonable rates and clearly loved horses more than people, which Gideon considered a mark in his favor. Agnes went into a warm stall with fresh water and a measure of grain, and Gideon watched the mare's ears come forward when she smelled the grain. A small, uncomplicated satisfaction after 3 days on cold trail. There was a boarding house 2 doors from the livery. Clean enough, $8 a week, rooms on separate floors, which neither of them discussed as an issue because it wasn't one. Gideon paid for his own room, which left him with $8 total, a fact he noted without particular emotion. "I'm going to the hotel tomorrow morning," Eliza said, in the hallway outside her door, "to ask about the position." "All right." She looked at him with a slight crease between her brows. "You don't have to come." "I know." She looked at him for another moment, deciding something. "Come if you want," she said, and went inside. Gideon went to his room, which had a bed and a washstand and a window that looked out over the mud street below, and sat on the edge of the bed for a while doing nothing in particular. The room was warm. It had 4 walls and a door that locked. After 3 days in the weather, that felt almost aggressive in its comfort. He hadn't been indoors, properly indoors, with heat and a roof that didn't flex, since October. Since the thing he didn't think about when he could help it. He thought about it now, because the warmth and the stillness made the walls thin in a way that cold and movement didn't allow. He thought about Deputy Marsh, who was 23 and had a wife in Billings expecting their first child. He thought about Deputy Coulter, who was 26 and had grown up in an orphanage and had no one to send word to. He thought about the call he'd made, the calculation that had seemed right at the time, as calculations always do right up until the moment they go catastrophically wrong. He'd been so certain. That was the part that stuck, not the outcome. He'd made peace, in a raw and incomplete way, with the outcome. It was the certainty beforehand that he couldn't stop turning over. 12 years of experience and instinct had told him he was right, and 12 years of experience and instinct had been wrong, and he didn't know yet what you were supposed to do with that. He lay back on the bed without taking off his boots and stared at the ceiling until sleep came for him, which it did eventually, the way it does when a body has been pushed far enough past its limits. The man at the Grand Continental Hotel's hiring office was named Percival Greer, and he had the particular manner of someone who had recently been promoted slightly beyond his natural ceiling and was managing this by being very deliberate about his suit jacket. He looked at Eliza across his desk with an expression that moved quickly through surprise, reassessment, and something that settled uncomfortably close to amusement. "Miss Hartwell," he said, looking down at the inquiry she'd handed him. "You've come about the head chef position." "I have." "From Whitmore's Bend." "Yes." "That's—" He paused. "That's quite a distance." 211 miles, Eliza said. "I kept track." Greer set the paper down and folded his hands on top of it with the careful deliberateness of a man choosing his next words. Gideon was standing near the door, which he'd positioned himself against with his arms crossed and his expression neutral. He watched Greer's face. "The position is a significant one," Greer said. "The Grand Continental will be the finest establishment between Denver and the Canadian border. Our guests will include railroad executives, territorial officials, investors. The dining room alone will seat 80. He paused again. We have already received applications from candidates with training at some of the finest establishments in the East. I'm aware, Eliza said. The standard of cuisine expected, Mr. Greer. Her voice didn't change temperature, but it stopped him cleanly. I didn't ride 211 miles to be told what the standard is. I know what the standard is. If you want to tell me I can't meet it before you've tasted my food, that's your choice. But I'd suggest it's not a good use of either of our mornings. Silence. Greer looked at her. Then he looked at Gideon, apparently seeking some kind of context. Gideon gave him nothing. Greer looked back at Eliza. There will be a formal trial, he said, with slightly less certainty than he'd started with. 3 days from now. The candidates will prepare a 3-course meal to be judged by a panel that includes the hotel's general manager and 2 guests with experience in fine dining. He picked up the paper again, made a mark on something. You'll be included. Thank you, Eliza said. She stood, collected her coat from the chair arm, and walked toward the door. Gideon held it open for her. Out on the street, in the cold morning air, he fell into step beside her. She was quiet for half a block before she spoke. He thinks I won't make the first round, she said. Probably. Good, she said. And she meant it the same way she'd meant everything else she said, plainly, without decoration. She spent the next 2 days preparing, not in the boarding house kitchen. The landlady, a Mrs. Crane, allowed it, but made clear through a series of pointed silences that she considered it an imposition. But Eliza found what she needed. She located the dry goods supplier and spent an hour going through his inventory with the focused attention of someone building an argument, not shopping. She visited the butcher and had a 20-minute conversation about the specific cut and age of the beef he was carrying. She talked to a Crow woman at the edge of town who sold herbs and dried goods and came away with 3 small bundles that she examined carefully and then packed into her bag with the rest. Gideon came with her on most of this, partly because he had nothing else to do and partly because he found it interesting. The way she moved through each transaction, asking precise questions, not accepting the first answer on quality, knowing exactly what she was looking for and why. By the second hour of the dry goods visit, even the supplier had stopped being impatient with her and started actually listening. You always shop like that? He asked, walking back. Like what? Like you're cross-examining a witness. She considered this. Food is specific, she said. The difference between good flour and cheap flour is in the texture, the moisture content, how it handles heat. If you don't ask, you get what someone else decided was good enough. Good enough isn't what I'm going for. What are you going for? She was quiet for a moment. Something that tastes like this place, she said. Not Boston, not Philadelphia. Here, what this country actually tastes like when someone cooks it properly. Gideon thought about that for the rest of the afternoon. It was on the second evening, while Eliza was in the boarding house kitchen, working through a test of some component of the meal she had planned, that Gideon's situation in Harlan's Fork clarified itself somewhat. He'd been at the saloon, not drinking heavily, just sitting with a beer, watching the room, old habit, when a man sat down across from him without being invited. This was a thing people occasionally did when they recognized him, which he'd learned meant either they wanted to hire him or they wanted to tell him something they thought he should know. This man, whose name turned out to be Wesley Drum, was the acting marshal of Harlan's Fork, recently appointed and visibly aware that he was not entirely equal to the position. He was maybe 40, with a deputy's background and a marshal's badge that still looked slightly too new. I know who you are, Drum said, not aggressively, just establishing. Most people do, Gideon said. I heard you came in yesterday with the woman going for the hotel cook position. I did. Drum turned his beer glass in a slow circle on the table. I won't lie to you. I could use experienced men. The town's growing faster than I can keep it orderly. A couple of the railroad crew bosses are running rough camps north of town. I've got 2 deputies who are fine men, and neither of them has ever dealt with anything more complicated than a Saturday night fight. He stopped turning the glass. I'm not asking for a commitment. I'm asking if you're interested in having a reason to stay. Gideon looked at the man. He was honest. That was clear enough. Honest and slightly overwhelmed and not trying to hide either. I'll think about it, Gideon said. Drum nodded, stood up, and left without pushing it, which Gideon found, on reflection, to be exactly the right call. He finished his beer and went back to the boarding house. Eliza was still in the kitchen when he got back. He could smell something, complex and warm and specific, coming from under the kitchen door. He knocked twice and opened it a crack. "How's it going?" She was standing at the stove with flour on her forearm and an expression of someone solving a problem that wasn't fully solved yet. There were 2 pans on the stovetop and a small roasting dish in the oven, and the kitchen smelled extraordinary. "The sauce isn't right yet," she said, without looking up. "What's wrong with it?" "Too sweet. I'm compensating for the dried herbs. The ones I got from the Crow woman are stronger than I expected, which is actually better, but I need to adjust the balance." She stirred something, tasted it off the spoon, and made a face that was somewhere between concentration and dissatisfaction. "It'll take another try." "Can I taste it?" She handed him the spoon. He tasted it. It was objectively the best thing he'd eaten since, possibly ever. The sweet she was complaining about was barely perceptible to him, layered underneath something earthy, and something else that he couldn't name but that tasted like cold air and pine smoke, and the particular quality of winter in high country. "It tastes fine to me," he said. "It's not ready," she said firmly, taking the spoon back. He leaned against the doorframe. "A man named Drum, the acting marshal, asked me about work today." She glanced at him then, quick, assessing. "And?" "I said I'd think about it." She turned back to the stove. "What are you thinking?" He was quiet for a moment. The kitchen was warm. The smells were warm. There was something about standing in a doorway watching someone work at something they were genuinely excellent at. It had a quality of rest to it, like being near a fire that was the right size. "I think I'm not done being a lawman," he said. "I thought I was. I came out here thinking I was. But I think what I was done with was a specific thing that happened, not the work itself." He paused. "There's a difference." Eliza stirred the sauce and didn't say anything immediately. Then, "Drum seems like a decent man?" "Seems like." "Then think about it seriously," she said. "Not as advice, exactly. As permission, maybe, from someone who didn't technically have the authority to give it, but gave it anyway and meant it." Gideon nodded and pushed off the doorframe. "Get some sleep eventually. When the sauce is right." He went upstairs. "What?" The morning of the trial arrived with a hard frost and a sky so clear it almost hurt to look at. There were 4 candidates. Gideon saw them when he and Eliza arrived at the hotel's service entrance, where a temporary kitchen had been set up in a large back room for the competition. A tall man from Boston named Aldrich, who carried himself with the careful dignity of someone who'd been told he was exceptional for a long time. A younger man from Philadelphia named Cortez, who was visibly nervous in the specific way of people who are good at what they do, but not yet comfortable being watched doing it. A woman from Denver named Halverson, who looked at Eliza with an expression that was either solidarity or rivalry, possibly both. And Eliza. The judging panel was set up in the adjoining dining room. 3 people at a long table, which included Greer and a severe-looking woman in her 50s named Caldwell, who was introduced as a dining consultant brought in from Chicago. Greer explained the format. Each candidate would have 2 hours to prepare a 3-course meal using the provided pantry plus any personal ingredients they'd brought. The panel would judge on technique, presentation, and suitability for the hotel's dining room. The Boston man, Aldrich, was already organizing his station with the efficiency of someone who had done exactly this before. Cortez was checking his knives. Halverson was reviewing something in a small notebook. Eliza set her bag on her station and began unpacking without looking at any of them. Gideon found a place against the far wall where he could watch without being in the way. He crossed his arms and watched. What happened in the first 30 minutes was less about cooking and more about the particular theater of 4 people who were all good at the same thing and all knew it and were each deciding privately what that meant for the next 2 hours. Aldrich moved through his prep with a kind of deliberate elegance, every cut precise, every movement slightly too aware of being observed. Cortez was faster and rougher, working with genuine focus that occasionally tipped into anxiety. Halverson was methodical, checking twice, tasting constantly. Eliza worked differently. She moved quietly. No performance, no awareness of the room. She'd arranged her station the way she arranged a campsite. Everything in its place for function, not appearance. The ingredients she'd brought from her own sources were organized in a row. The herbs from the Crow woman, A cut of beef she'd selected herself from the butcher. Dried goods she'd chosen with 20 minutes of interrogation. She worked through her prep with the particular unhurried focus of someone who has run the whole thing in their head already and is now simply executing. The Boston man Aldrich glanced at her station somewhere around the 40-minute mark. Gideon saw it. That quick, involuntary check when you realize someone nearby is doing something you weren't expecting. One of the hotel staff, a young man helping manage the event, passed by Eliza's station and managed to jostle her spice arrangement. 3 of the small glass bottles shifted. 1 fell toward the edge. Eliza caught it without looking up from what she was cutting. Set it back. Kept cutting. The young man apologized. She nodded once and didn't break her rhythm. The hour mark came and went. The smells in the room had shifted from separate and competing to layered and complex, the particular olfactory chaos of good food being made in multiple directions at once. Gideon hadn't eaten breakfast and was beginning to regret it. Then something happened. The wood-burning stove at the back of the room, one of 2 providing heat for the kitchen setup, began drawing wrong. Not dangerously, but wrong. The draft was pulling smoke back instead of up, which meant the back section of the kitchen was getting the wrong airflow, which mattered for open-flame cooking in ways that weren't immediately obvious, but would be in another 15 minutes when temperatures started fluctuating. Gideon noticed it because he'd spent 3 days maintaining an outdoor fire under Eliza's instruction and had absorbed more about fire behavior than he'd intended to. He looked at Eliza. She was already looking at the stove, had already noticed. He watched her make a quick, quiet adjustment to her setup, moving 2 pans slightly, repositioning the roasting dish, making 3 small changes that compensated for the draft change in a way that required understanding exactly how each element of her meal was going to be affected. She did it in about 45 seconds and went back to work. Aldrich, whose station was closer to the problem stove, didn't notice for another 8 minutes. By then, his saucepan was running too cool, and he had to rush a correction that cost him some control on the texture. Gideon watched this without expression. The 2-hour mark arrived. The plates went out to the panel in the order the candidates had been assigned. Gideon found a position near the door between the kitchen and the dining room, not directly watching the panel because that wasn't his place, but close enough to hear the quality of the silence from that room, which he'd learned was its own kind of information. Aldrich's plates went out first. The silence from the dining room was approving, the sounds of a panel encountering something technically accomplished and expected. Cortez's plates went out. A longer silence, then voices. Surprised, he thought, or engaged. Halverson's plates. More voices, more animated. Then Eliza's. What came out of her kitchen, when Gideon caught a glimpse of the plates going by, was not what he'd expected from the conversation about frontier cuisine and the spirit of the land. He'd imagined something rough or homespun, a deliberate statement through simplicity. What she'd made was simple in the way that well-made things are simple, not reduced, but concentrated. The beef, sliced thin, with a sauce that was dark and deep and smelled of the dried herbs and something wine-adjacent she'd worked in. Root vegetables roasted until their edges were dark. A first course that was a clear broth so clean and precise it looked like it had been made in a restaurant kitchen, not over a camp stove. The silence from the dining room when those plates landed was different from the others. It was longer. Gideon stood against the wall and listened to it. One of the other candidates, Cortez, the nervous one from Philadelphia, had come to stand not far from Gideon, ostensibly cleaning a pan, but actually, Gideon suspected, listening the same way he was. "She's good," Cortez said quietly, not looking at him. "Yes," Gideon said. "I mean genuinely good." He said it without bitterness, with something closer to professional respect. "That broth, the technique on that is not boarding house technique. Where did she train?" "I don't think she trained anywhere, specifically." Cortez was quiet for a moment, processing this. "Then she figured it out herself." "That's my understanding." He nodded slowly, like he was filing that information somewhere. "That's harder," he said. "Doing it yourself, without someone showing you the language. That's harder than school." From the dining room, there was the sound of voices. And then, clear and distinct, Caldwell, the Chicago consultant, saying something that Gideon couldn't make out precisely, but whose tone he could read perfectly well. It was the tone of someone who had been surprised in a way they hadn't budgeted for and were now reassessing their whole morning. Eliza came to stand beside Gideon. Her expression was composed and even, but he'd been watching her face for 3 days, and he knew what the set of her jaw looked like when she was waiting for something that mattered. "It's quiet in there," she said. "Yes," he said. "Is that good quiet or bad quiet?" He thought about it honestly. "I think that's the kind of quiet that means they're talking about you after they stop talking about the food." She looked at the door for another moment. Then she went back to her station and began cleaning it with the same focused efficiency she did everything else. Gideon stayed where he was and kept listening. The verdict wouldn't come until later. Greer had announced the decision would be delivered the following morning. But something had shifted in that room. Gideon could feel it the way you feel a change in weather before the clouds arrive. Something had moved. He'd stood in enough rooms where decisions were being made about things that mattered to know what that felt like from the outside. He'd also stood in enough rooms to know that feeling it and being right about it weren't always the same thing. He hoped, with a quiet, specific intensity that surprised him a little, that this was one of the times they were. That night, Eliza didn't go back to the boarding house kitchen. She sat on the front step of the building in her coat, in the cold, with a cup of tea she'd made upstairs, and looked at the street. Gideon found her there when he came back from a walk he'd taken, partly out of restlessness, and partly because the town at night told him things about itself that it didn't reveal during the day: who was moving, where the money was, where the trouble was collecting. He sat on the step beside her without asking. There was enough room. For a while, neither of them said anything. The street was quieter at this hour, but not quiet. A town in this kind of build-out never went fully to sleep. Down the road, lamplight from one of the saloons spilled yellow across the frozen mud. Somewhere further, a hammer was still going, some crew working through dark on the hotel framework. "Do you think it was enough?" she asked. He didn't pretend he didn't know what she was asking. "I think you made the best meal in that room today," he said. "I think the panel knows that." "That's not what I asked." He considered. "I think knowing something is right and choosing it are sometimes different things, especially for people who had already decided on the answer before the question was asked." He paused. "But I also think Caldwell, the woman from Chicago, I don't think she's the kind of person who decides before the question's asked, and she ran the room in there." Eliza held her cup in both hands and looked at the street. "I didn't cook for them," she said. "I know. I thought about it, about what they'd want to see, what the hotel is going for, the Eastern style, the fine dining convention. I could have done it." She paused. "I chose not to." "I know that too. If I lose because of it—" She stopped, started again, differently. "I need to know I made the right call, not the safe call." Gideon looked at the side of her face, the angle of it in the lamplight from the street, the set of her jaw, the particular quality of steadiness she wore even when she was genuinely uncertain about something. "You made the right call," he said. "I don't say that to make you feel better. I say it because a person who cooks a meal for an audience instead of cooking the meal that's true to what they know, that's a person who talks themselves out of their own gift. And you didn't do that." She was quiet for a moment. "You've been thinking about this kind of thing," she said. "You said that to me once before." "Keeps being true." He almost smiled. "I told Drum I'd take the deputy work," he said, "starting next week." She turned and looked at him then, with an expression that was something close to relief. Not for herself, but in the way people look when someone they've been worried about makes a decision in the right direction. "Good," she said. "It's not a permanent answer," he said, "but it's a start." She nodded and looked back at the street. They sat there for another 20 minutes without talking, which was comfortable in the particular way that silence is comfortable when you've come through something difficult with someone, and neither of you needs to fill the air to prove you're still there. The hammering down at the hotel framework went on and on into the cold night, building something out of raw material, slowly and without rest. The decision came at 9 in the morning. Greer had scheduled it for the hotel's temporary front office, a framed-out room on the ground floor that smelled of fresh lumber and plaster dust, with 2 chairs set facing his desk and a window that looked out on the construction scaffolding. Gideon came with Eliza because she hadn't asked him not to, and he stood near the wall the same way he'd stood near the wall in the kitchen the day before, present without crowding the space. The other 3 candidates had been notified first, by letter slid under their boarding house doors before dawn. Gideon knew this because Cortez had been sitting in the dining room when they came down for breakfast, with the particular quality of stillness that meant he'd already read his letter and was deciding how to feel about it. He'd looked up when Eliza came through the door. "You should know," Cortez said to her directly, "that I told Caldwell yesterday afternoon that your broth was the best thing in the room. I want that said." Eliza had looked at him for a moment. "Thank you," she said. Not effusively, just directly, the way she received everything. "I mean it as a professional opinion," he said, not a consolation. "I took it that way." He'd nodded and gone back to his coffee. Now, sitting in the chair across from Greer's desk, Eliza had her hands folded in her lap and her back straight in the way of someone who has decided that however this goes, they will not be caught slouching when it arrives. Greer came in with a paper in his hand and a different expression than he'd worn at their first meeting. The studied neutrality was gone, replaced by something he was visibly managing. He sat down, set the paper on the desk, and didn't look at it. "Miss Hartwell," he said, "the panel met for 2 hours last evening." "I understand." "There was—" He paused, chose something. "There was considerable discussion." Gideon watched his face. "Mrs. Caldwell was direct in her assessment," Greer continued. "She described your meal as the most technically accomplished and most conceptually coherent of the 4 presented." He said this carefully, like a man reading from a document he hadn't written. "She was particularly specific about the broth. She said—" He glanced down at the paper now, reading directly. "She said it demonstrated an understanding of flavor construction that most trained chefs spend years trying to formalize, and that you appeared to have arrived at through instinct and practice alone." The room was quiet enough that Gideon could hear the sawing from the scaffolding outside. "The position is yours," Greer said, "if you want it." Eliza didn't move for a moment. Her expression didn't collapse into relief or break into anything demonstrative. She absorbed it the same way she'd absorbed everything else on this trip, with a steadiness that wasn't coldness but was something else. Something that came from a person who had held on to a thing for a long time through difficulty and had learned not to let go of the holding even after the difficulty passed. "I want it," she said. "Good." Greer picked up the paper and set it aside. "You'll want to review the kitchen. It's not fully outfitted yet. We're 3 weeks from completion on the east wing where it's housed. There are conversations to be had about staff, about the menu for the opening, about—" "Mr. Greer," Eliza stood. "I'll want to begin those conversations today if that's suitable." He blinked. "Today. 3 weeks to opening is not a generous runway for a kitchen that hasn't been staffed. I'd like to see the space this morning." He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was recalibrating again, the 3rd time Gideon had watched him do this in 2 meetings. "Of course," Greer said. "I'll arrange for the kitchen supervisor to meet you at 10. Eliza thanked him, shook his hand with brisk efficiency, and walked to the door. Gideon pushed off the wall and followed. Outside on the raw lumber sidewalk, in the cold morning air, she stopped and stood still for a moment. Just a moment. 10 seconds. Maybe 15. Her breath came out white in the cold. She looked at the middle distance, at nothing in particular, and Gideon stood beside her and didn't say anything. Then she exhaled slowly and turned to him. "All right," she said. "All right," he agreed. She almost smiled. It was a small, real thing. There for a second and then gone, replaced by the focused expression of someone who already had a list forming in their head. "I need to see the kitchen," she said. "At 10. Before 10. I want to see it cold before anyone's in it." She was already moving down the sidewalk. "Are you busy?" He wasn't busy. He didn't start with drum until Monday. "Lead the way," he said. The kitchen was a revelation, and not entirely a good one. It occupied the entire east section of the hotel's ground floor. A large, high-ceilinged space with 3 wood-burning range stoves, a central work table of solid oak, a dry larder along the north wall, and a cold storage room accessed through a heavy iron door at the back. The bones of it were excellent. The state of it, 3 weeks from the hotel's projected opening, was somewhere between ambitious and disorganized. Eliza walked through it without speaking for 10 minutes. She opened every cabinet, tested every stove damper, checked the cold storage temperature, ran water from the pump at the far end to check the pressure. lifted the lids off every container in the dry larder, and looked inside. Gideon followed at a respectful distance, watching her build a picture of the place in her head the way he built a picture of a territory, methodically, without assumptions. 3 stoves aren't enough, she said finally. For 80 covers? For 80 covers, 3 courses, with the kind of menu this hotel is going to need to justify its reputation. You need 4, minimum 5. She stood with her arms crossed, looking at the north wall. The dry larder needs more shelving. Right now, it can't hold more than 3 days of supply at capacity, and the cold storage is running too warm. That door seal is leaking. Can you work with it? She looked at him. For the opening, he said, until they can make the changes. She was quiet for a moment, running some internal calculation. I can work with it, she said. It'll be harder than it needs to be. But yes. She turned and looked at the central work table, at the full dimension of the room, and something in her expression shifted into something that was close to the look she'd had standing at the top of the rise looking down at Harlan's Fork, taking the measure of a thing, deciding what it was going to become. It's a good kitchen, she said. Under the mess, it's a genuinely good kitchen. It'll be yours in 3 weeks. It's mine now, she said, without particular arrogance, just as a fact. I just have to fix it first. Homta. The days that followed moved at 2 different speeds depending on which part of Harlan's Fork you were in. Eliza's world contracted to the hotel and what it needed. She was there every morning before 7, working alongside the construction crews to direct changes to the kitchen layout that she'd already argued for and mostly won, doing prep work in the temporary setup while the permanent kitchen was finished. Interviewing the staff candidates Greer sent her way with the same methodical precision she applied to selecting produce. She hired a pastry cook named Henrietta, who was 53, round-faced, and had an accent from somewhere in Central Europe that Gideon couldn't place, and a line cook named Ruiz, who was 25 and fast-handed and said little but moved through a kitchen like he'd been born inside one. Gideon's world expanded outward. He'd started with drum on a Monday, and by Wednesday he'd already handled 3 situations that clarified for him exactly what the acting marshal had meant when he said the town was growing faster than he could keep it orderly. The railroad construction camps north of town were rough. Not unusually rough for a boom camp. Men working hard in cold conditions for wages that were fair but not generous, with limited ways to spend money and limited supervision. But rough enough that the Saturday nights were becoming a problem that spilled into Harlan's Fork proper, and that Drum's 2 regular deputies were not equipped to manage alone. The first time Gideon walked into the main camp on a Thursday afternoon, there was a moment, maybe 20 seconds, where the room recalibrated around him the way rooms did. Not because of the badge, which was new enough that half the camp didn't know to recognize it, because of the way he stood in a doorway, because of the particular quality of someone who has been in difficult rooms for a long time and has stopped being afraid of them. Drum noticed it afterward. They knew you, he said. They knew the type, Gideon said. It's the same thing. He didn't love being back. He didn't hate it either. It was work he knew how to do, and doing it in a town where he had no particular history and no particular weight of expectation on the badge felt different from how it had felt before October. Lighter, maybe. Or just less tangled. He still thought about October. He probably always would. But the thinking had changed quality since Montana. Since crawling through the snow. Since the broth. Since Eliza's voice cutting through the wind asking him if he planned to die there. The weight of it hadn't left, but it had stopped being the kind of weight that pins a man down. It had become the kind he carried, which was worse in some ways and more manageable in others. He didn't examine this too closely. He'd learned that examining things too closely was its own kind of trap. What he did was work. He walked his beat, talked to the camp bosses, learned the names of the men who were trouble-looking and the names of the ones who were not. He helped Drum draft a Saturday night ordinance that moved the worst of the drinking traffic off the main street, which solved maybe a third of the problem and bought time for the rest. He ate dinner most evenings in the boarding house, and 2 or 3 times a week Eliza was there across the table, sometimes with flowers still on her sleeve, sometimes with the focused inward expression of someone still working through a problem they'd left in the kitchen. They talked about the town and what it was becoming, about Drum and his deputies, about Henrietta's extraordinary pastry work and Ruiz's knife speed, which Eliza described with the same professional admiration that Cortez had shown her, about what it meant to build something in a place that was still deciding what it was. They didn't talk about what they were to each other because it wasn't a conversation that had an obvious beginning, and neither of them was the type to force one. Something had formed between them on the trail. Not romantic exactly, or not only that, but something with weight and reliability. The kind of thing you don't manufacture and can't fully name, but know when you're inside it. It was on a Tuesday evening, 3 days before the hotel's opening, that the first serious crack appeared. Eliza came into dinner late, which was unusual. When she sat down, she had the look of someone managing anger rather than feeling it. The compressed, careful quality of a person who has made a decision not to react to something until they've thought it through. "What happened?" Gideon said. "Greer came to the kitchen today." She picked up her fork and set it down again. "He brought a man named Whitfield, a food writer, apparently. Comes from a Chicago paper, here to cover the hotel opening." "That's not bad for the hotel." "No." She picked up the fork again. Whitfield asked Greer, in front of me, whether the head chef had been finalized or whether they were still considering options. She said it flat, without inflection. Greer told him the position had been filled. Whitfield asked who. Greer told him. Whitfield looked at me. I was 3 feet away, and said, and I'm quoting directly, "Is the dining room menu being handled by someone with proper credentials, or is this an experiment?" The dining room was not loud, but whatever ambient noise was in it seemed to simplify around their table. "What did Greer say?" Gideon asked. "Nothing useful." She cut something on her plate. "He said something about the trial process and the panel's decision, and Whitfield said he looked forward to seeing what a frontier cook could do with a fine dining menu, which in his tone was not a compliment." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "Are you going to let that change anything?" She looked at him. "I mean in the kitchen," he said, "and how you're planning the menu." "No," she said. "Not immediately, not without thought, but with conviction." "Then he's noise." "He's noise with a newspaper column," she said. "If he writes that the Grand Continental's kitchen is run by an experiment, it reaches Chicago and Denver and every investor who's watching this hotel to decide whether it's worth their attention." "That's true," Gideon said. He didn't minimize it. "And the way you answer it is the same way you answered Greer in that first meeting. You don't explain yourself. You make the food." She looked at him across the table with an expression that was somewhere between irritated and considering. "You know," she said, "for a man who spent 3 weeks trying to disappear into a snowdrift, you give a reasonable amount of advice. You can ignore it. I'm not ignoring it." She picked up the fork and actually ate something. "It's just annoying when the advice is right." The opening night of the Grand Continental Hotel arrived on a Thursday in late March, when the last of the winter had retreated to the upper elevations, and Harlan's Fork had the particular quality of a town breathing out after a long-held breath. The dining room seated 80, as promised, and on opening night, 73 of those seats were filled. Railroad executives, territorial officials, the handful of wealthy landowners who'd followed the rail line west and were now deciding whether the town was worth investing in more heavily. Whitfield, the food writer, was at a table near the window with a notebook beside his plate. Gideon was not in the dining room. He was on duty. Drum had pulled extra hours for opening night, correctly anticipating that the general celebration in town would require management. But he'd arranged to be on the block that included the hotel's front entrance, which meant he could hear things. What he heard, starting at about 9 o'clock, was the quality of noise from inside the hotel's dining room change. It started as the regular sound of a full room, voices, movement, silverware. Around 9, it shifted to something more animated, the particular pitch of people who are talking about what they're eating rather than talking around it. By 9:30, Gideon could hear it clearly from the street. Not loud, not boisterous, but engaged in a way that had nothing to do with the room's decoration or the hotel's ambition. That was a room full of people who had been surprised by something on their plate. He finished his round at 10 and went back to the boarding house. At 10:45, Eliza came in through the front door. She was still in her kitchen clothes, a white apron over her working dress, both carrying the evidence of 4 hours of intense service. Her hair had come partially loose. There was a red mark on her right forearm from what looked like a close encounter with a hot pan edge. She looked exhausted, and something else that took him a moment to identify. He was sitting in this front room with a cup of bad coffee when she came in, and he looked at her. She stopped in the doorway. 73 covers, she said, 3 courses each. Every plate went out right. She said it like she was verifying something, checking the number against what was real. Ruiz dropped a saucepan in the second hour. Henrietta's timing on the desserts was off by 5 minutes, and we had to hold the back tables. She paused. And Whitfield? What about Whitfield? He sent a note to the kitchen. She reached into her apron pocket and held up a small folded paper. After the first course. Gideon looked at it. What does it say? She opened it, read it aloud in a voice stripped of any performance. Please convey to the chef my compliments on the broth. I have not tasted its equivalent in 3 years of dining professionally, and I have dined in 4 countries. She folded it again. I look forward to the balance of the meal. The front room was quiet. He published? Gideon asked. He'll file tomorrow. Greer told me. She looked at the folded note in her hand. I don't know what he'll write. I think you know. She looked up at him. A man who sends that note after the first course doesn't file a negative review, Gideon said. Eliza folded the note one more time and put it back in her pocket. She sat down in the chair across from his, dropping into it with the full weight of someone who has been on their feet for 7 hours and is only now allowing themselves to feel it. I'm not going to say I told you so, he said. Good. I'm going to say I knew you were going to do that, and I'm glad I was here to see it happen. She looked at him for a moment. Her face was tired, and the mark on her arm was going to be a proper burn bruise by morning, and her hair was falling out of its arrangement on 3 sides. And she looked, in this particular moment, more like herself than he'd ever seen her. Gideon, she said. What? Thank you. She said it without elaboration, without specifying what for. The fire in the snow, the 40 feet of crawling, the 3 days on the trail, the morning in the hotel kitchen, the woman on the street, the note on the table, all of it, or some of it, or one specific thing he'd said at some specific moment that had mattered. He understood what she meant. He wasn't the kind of man who could receive a thank you gracefully, and he knew it, so he didn't try. Get some sleep, he said. She did. He sat in the front room with the bad coffee going cold in his cup and listened to Harlan's fork settle into the night around him. The distant sound of the saloons, a horse somewhere, the wind off the mountain coming down cold and clear, and thought about how a thing you've been moving toward for a long time feels different when you arrive at it than it does when you're still going. Not worse, just different. Real in a way that the idea of it never is. Down the street, the Grand Continental Hotel's windows were still lit. The last of the kitchen staff cleaning up, probably, putting the room back in order for tomorrow. Eliza's kitchen. The one she'd walked into 3 weeks ago and looked at with the expression of someone who already knew what it was going to be. Gideon finished the cold coffee and went to bed. 3 days later, Whitfield's column ran in 2 papers. The Chicago one he wrote for, and a territorial paper out of Helena that had picked it up. He described the Grand Continental's opening dinner as the most compelling meal he'd eaten west of the Mississippi, called the broth an act of culinary intelligence, and referred to the head chef, one Eliza Hartwell, of Whitmore's Bend, as a cook of rare instinct and serious ability who had, in one dinner service, done more for the reputation of frontier cuisine than a decade of dismissive Eastern opinion had allowed it. Greer left a copy of the column on Eliza's work table without a note. She read it while she was doing prep for the lunch service. Then she set it aside and went back to work. Gideon heard about it from Drum, who'd heard about it from the telegraph operator, who'd been asked to send a copy to the Denver paper. Your friend? Drum said over coffee at the marshal's office that morning. What about her? She's going to be famous, Drum said, if the Denver paper runs it and the Helena paper runs it. He shrugged. This is the kind of thing that travels. Gideon thought about a woman in a pine bark coat standing 8 feet from a man face down in the snow, asking him if he was going to die there or if he was going to earn his place by her fire. It was always going to travel, he said. She just had to get somewhere people could see it. Drum looked at him with the expression of a man who understood he was missing some context. But he let it go, the way he let most things go, which was one of the qualities that made him better suited for the job than he gave himself credit for. Outside, the March sun was doing something genuine to the snow on the street, turning the surface to something that glittered in a way that winter snow doesn't. Spring was still weeks away, maybe more in the high country, but down in the town there was something coming through in the light. A quality of not done yet, that Gideon recognized. He put his hat on and went back to work, and went back. April came to Harlan's Fork the way spring always came to high country Montana, reluctantly, in fits, with cold nights that reminded you it wasn't done with winter, yet even when the afternoons were warm enough to work in shirt sleeves. The mud season was in full force, turning the main street into something that swallowed boot heels and wagon wheels with equal enthusiasm. And the town had the particular energy of a place that had survived its first hard winter and was now deciding what it wanted to be. The Grand Continental had been open 6 weeks. Whitfield's column had run in 4 papers by the end of March, and the effect on the hotel's reservation book was the kind of thing Greer discussed with barely concealed amazement every time he encountered Eliza in the hallway. They were booked solid through May. A letter had arrived from a cattle baron in Denver asking about a private dining arrangement for a party of 12. 2 separate families from Helena had written to inquire about extended stays. Eliza received all of this information with the same focused attention she gave everything, noting it, filing it, immediately translating it into what it meant for the kitchen. More covers meant more staff. More staff meant more training. She'd hired 2 additional line cooks in the second week, a woman named Sue Lynn, who had come west with the railroad and turned out to have an extraordinary sensitivity to flavor balance, and a young man named Percy, who was slow on knife work but had a patience with long preparations that most 20-year-olds didn't. She also, sometime in the 4th week, began paying herself a wage that allowed her to move out of the boarding house and into a proper room above the dry goods store on the east end of town. The room had 2 windows and enough space for a writing desk, which she used most evenings to work through menu plans and supply orders with the same quiet intensity she brought to everything. Gideon had helped her move her things in a single trip that took 20 minutes because she didn't own much. He'd noted this, the economy of what she kept, and thought it said something about a person who had been moving toward a destination for a long time and hadn't let herself accumulate weight she might have to put down if things went wrong. Things hadn't gone wrong. He thought about that sometimes. His own situation had settled into something with shape, if not quite permanence. Drum had formally asked him to stay on as chief deputy in the second week of April, a promotion from the informal arrangement they'd started with a proper wage attached. Gideon had said he'd think about it, which Drum had correctly interpreted as yes pending some internal negotiation that Gideon was working through privately. The work was good, not easy. The railroad camps remained a management problem that didn't have a clean solution, and the town was growing fast enough that new trouble arrived with every new face, but good in the specific way that work you're suited to is good. He understood the rhythms of it. He was competent at it in a way that didn't require performance or pretense. He'd stopped waking up at 3 a.m. thinking about October as often. It still happened. He suspected it always would, but it had become a thing he carried rather than a thing that carried him. And there was a difference. The 3 Crail brothers rode into Harlan's Fork on a Wednesday afternoon in the second week of April. Gideon was on the north end of the main street when they came in, talking to Dorsey, the liveryman, about a report of trouble at the camp 2 miles out. He didn't notice them immediately. There were always riders coming into town, and 3 men on horseback wasn't a thing that warranted attention on its own. But he noticed them. He noticed because of the way they rode. Not the road weariness of men who'd been traveling a long way toward somewhere, but the slow, deliberate pace of men who had arrived at a destination and were now looking for something specific. Their eyes moved differently. They checked the street the way you check a room when you're trying to locate a specific face. Gideon kept his conversation with Dorsey going without changing his posture or his tone. He watched from a peripheral angle as the 3 men reined up outside the saloon, tied their horses, and went in. "You know those men?" Dorsey asked, with the particular sensitivity of a man who'd watched Gideon's attention shift. "Not yet," Gideon said. He finished the conversation, walked back to the marshal's office, and told Drum. 3 men, hard-ridden, not road-worn. There's a difference. They were looking for something when they came in. He paused. "Did any wires come in this week with names?" Drum checked the recent telegrams, nothing with names, but there was a notice from a marshal's office in eastern Montana, a general alert dated 10 days prior, about 3 brothers named Crail, who were believed to be moving west following information about a former U.S. Marshal named Hale. Drum set the paper on the desk between them. Gideon looked at it. "Crail," he said. You know them. It wasn't quite a question. Gideon picked up the notice and read it through once, though he could have told Drum the relevant parts without it. 4 years ago, I was part of a federal action in the Powder River country. We brought in 2 men, Denton Crail and his son, rustling, robbery, 2 counts of assault. Denton died in custody before trial. His son did 2 years. He set the paper back down. There were 3 younger brothers at the time. They were minors, not charged. And now they're grown, Drum said. And now they're grown. Drum looked at the paper and then at Gideon with the expression of a man running the arithmetic of a situation he'd been handed and wasn't sure he liked. What do you want to do? Talk to them, Gideon said. Tonight. Just talk. Talking first covers everything I need to know about what comes after. Drum nodded slowly. He didn't argue. One of the things Gideon had come to respect about Wesley Drum was that the man had a genuine instinct for when someone in the room knew more about a problem than he did, and when that was the case, he got out of the way. It was a harder skill than it sounded. I'll have Reedy on the back of the saloon, Drum said, naming his steadier deputy. You want backup inside? Not visible. Gideon went to the Grand Continental first. He found Eliza in the kitchen in the hour between the lunch service breaking down and the dinner prep starting. The brief stillness of a kitchen mid-afternoon when the fire is banked and the counters are clean and the next several hours of work are visible ahead but not yet begun. She was at the central table with her supply ledger, running numbers with the focused efficiency of someone who'd been doing this long enough to find it automatic. She looked up when he came through the kitchen door, read his face with the speed she'd developed over months of knowing him, and set the pencil down. What is it? She said. He told her. Not all of it, not the full history, just what was relevant. 3 men, the Crail name, what it connected to. She listened without interrupting, which was how she always listened. This is about the Powder River action, she said, when he'd finished. That's my read. And you think they're here for you specifically? The wire says so. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the ledger on the table without seeing it. Are you going to run? The question was direct, no judgment in it either direction, just asking what his plan was. No. She looked up at him. I ran for 6 months, he said, into Montana, into the snow, into whatever that was I was doing before you found me. I'm done running from things. He paused. Running doesn't solve anything. It just relocates the problem and lets it get worse while you're moving. Eliza held his gaze for a moment. Then, what do you need from me? Nothing. I wanted you to know. In case... He stopped. In case it goes wrong. In case it goes wrong, he agreed. She looked at him steadily. It's not going to go wrong, she said. Not comforting him, not making a promise she couldn't keep. Just stating a position. The way she stated everything, with the specific weight of a person who has made a decision about what's true and is not currently accepting alternatives. He wanted to say something. He didn't say it. Instead, he stood in the kitchen doorway for another moment, in the smell of the afternoon, banked fire, dried herbs, clean wood. And then he said, Lock up early tonight. I'll do no such thing. Eliza. I close at 10, she said. Same as every night. You deal with your problem, and I'll deal with my dinner service. She picked up the pencil again. Go. He went. The Crail brothers were at a table in the back third of the saloon when Gideon walked in at 7 that evening, which was late enough that the room had filled out and the noise level covered a conversation, and early enough that nobody was drunk enough to be stupid yet. He'd clocked them before he pushed through the door. The shapes of them through the window, the position they'd chosen. The way the older one was facing the entrance. They were expecting someone. They'd picked their table deliberately. He walked across the room without hurrying. People parted around him in the subtle way of a room that reads a shift in its own atmosphere without knowing it's doing it. He pulled a chair from a neighboring table, turned it backward, and sat down at the end of theirs. The 3 brothers looked at him. The oldest, he'd be the one the wire had named Callum, maybe 26, was broad-faced with his father's coloring, if Gideon was remembering Denton Crail correctly. The middle one, perhaps 22, had a sharper look, the kind of permanent suspicion that comes from a specific kind of childhood. The youngest was maybe 19. He had a different quality from the other 2, something less hardened, still arriving at its final form. "Gideon Hale," Callum said. Not a question. "That's right. You knew we were coming. I knew this morning." Callum's jaw shifted slightly. He'd expected the conversation to start differently, probably with more distance, more maneuvering. Gideon being direct about what he knew was disorienting in a way that was useful. "You know why we're here," Callum said. "I know what you think you know," Gideon said. "I'm less certain it's accurate." The middle one, he'd find out his name was Wren, leaned forward slightly. "You helped arrest our father and brother. Our father died in custody. Our brother did 2 years and came out wrong." His voice was controlled, but the control was costing him something. "That's not a matter of accuracy." "The arrest was lawful," Gideon said. I understand that doesn't make it easier." "You understand nothing," Wren said. "Then explain it to me." That stopped him. Wren looked at Callum, then back at Gideon, not sure what to do with an argument that kept declining to become a fight. "What do we need to explain?" Callum said. "You know what happened." "I know my part of it," Gideon said. "I'm asking about the rest." He looked at each of them in sequence, Callum, Wren, and then the youngest, who hadn't spoken yet. "You've been following this for 4 years. That's a long time to carry something. Where did it start? And who told you where to find me?" Callum's eyes narrowed. "What does it matter where we heard?" "It matters because I was in Montana for 6 months before I came here," Gideon said. Not hiding, just moving, no fixed location. If someone knew to send you west to Harlan's Fork specifically, they had more current information than most people should have. He kept his voice even, almost conversational. The register he'd learned over 12 years made men think rather than react. "Someone pointed you at me. I'd like to know who." Something crossed Callum's face. A crack in the certainty of the errand, small but real. The youngest one spoke. "It was Walsh," he said. Callum turned on him immediately. "Eli?" "It was Walsh," the boy, Eli, said again. He was looking at Gideon with an expression that was complicated in the way that young men's faces are when they're in the middle of deciding who they are. "Fletcher Walsh. He came to us in January, said he knew where to find you, said you'd gotten our father and brother locked up and cost him a business arrangement he never recovered from." He paused, said we had a right to settle it. The name landed in Gideon's chest like a stone in cold water. Fletcher Walsh. He hadn't heard that name in 4 years, but he knew exactly where it fit in the architecture of what had happened in the Powder River country. Walsh had been a land broker operating on the margins of the rustling operation. Not a Crail, not directly indicted, but connected. He'd been investigated, and the case against him had been thin enough that charges hadn't stuck. He'd walked away, and Gideon had always suspected he'd walked away angry. "What did Walsh tell you about the Powder River action?" Gideon said, keeping his voice level. Callum was rigid with something. Fury at Eli for speaking, or fury at Gideon for asking, or fury at something underneath both that was less clearly directed. "He told us you led the action, that you made the calls, that our father would have survived if you'd done your job right. And you believed him." "Why wouldn't we?" "Because Walsh had his own reasons to want someone to blame that wasn't him," Gideon said. "He lost money in the arrest. He lost business partners in an operation he'd spent 5 years building. He had every reason to point 3 grieving men at the face they already knew instead of the one they didn't." He paused. "Your father was arrested by a 4-man team, Callum. I was one of 4. The call that went wrong, the one in the barn, the one where the situation escalated. I wasn't the senior man on that action. I was the youngest deputy there." Silence. Wren's jaw was tight. Walsh said, "Walsh told you what was useful to him," Gideon said. "I'm telling you what I know from being there." "How do we know that's true?" Callum said. His voice had changed, still hard, but uncertain underneath in a way it hadn't been 2 minutes ago. "You don't," Gideon said. "You have to decide what you believe." He looked at each of them again. "But I'll tell you this. Your father was not well when we transported him. That's true. He was in worse condition than we knew when we made the arrest. The coroner said his heart had been failing for some time, months before we ever came into the Powder River country. There was an inquiry. The findings are on record in the federal office in Helena." He paused. Nobody hid that. It's there if you want to look at it. Eli was watching him with that same complicated expression, working through something, weighing something, doing the slow, difficult work of a young person whose certainty about a story they've been told is starting to show cracks. Callum's hand had been near his belt since Gideon sat down. It was still there. Gideon was aware of it the way he was aware of most things in a room, peripherally, continuously, with the background part of his attention that never fully switched off. The hand didn't move. "Walsh sent us here," Callum said. Slowly, like he was feeling the sentence out while he said it. "Walsh sent you here to do something Walsh didn't want to do himself," Gideon said. "That's how that kind of man works." More silence. The saloon moved around them. The bar noise, the card game in the corner, the particular insulation of a room full of people not paying attention to one specific table. Wren looked at Callum. There was a conversation in that look, years of it, the compressed language of brothers who'd grown up in the same difficulty. Gideon let them have it without interrupting. Callum's hand moved away from his belt. Not dramatically, just dropped to the table, flat and open. "If what you're saying about the record is true," he said, then Walsh used you," Gideon said, "to clean up something he didn't want attached to his name." He kept his voice without verdict, without the particular satisfaction that would have closed Callum back down. "What you do with that is your business." Eli looked at his oldest brother, then at Gideon. "Our brother," he said. "Cade. He did 2 years." "I know. He came out. He's not right. He has trouble with things." Eli's voice was steady, but it was an effort. "That's real. Whatever Walsh said or didn't say, that part is real." "I know it is," Gideon said, "and I'm not going to tell you the arrest didn't change things for your family. It did. The law doesn't fix that, and I can't fix that." He held Eli's eyes. "But coming in here tonight with guns drawn doesn't fix it either. It just adds to it." The youngest Crail brother sat with that for a long moment. Then he looked at Callum and said, "I'm not doing this." Callum looked at him. "I rode 400 miles on Walsh's word," Eli said, "and I believed him because I wanted something to be angry at that had a face." He pushed back slightly from the table. Not leaving, just creating distance from the idea of what they'd come here to do. "But this man is telling us Walsh used us, and I think it's true, and I'm not doing this." The room seemed to hold something. Not breath exactly, but some equivalent. Gideon watched Callum's face, which was moving through things that didn't have easy words. Wren said nothing. He was looking at the table. Callum looked at Gideon for a long time. His face was a hard face, carved from years of anger and grief and the particular bitter fuel of a story he'd been told and had held on to because it was the shape that made the worst things make sense. Giving up a story like that wasn't easy. Sometimes it wasn't even possible. "The record's in Helena," Callum said. "Federal Marshal's Office. Ask for the Powder River Inquiry, 1879. Your name gets you access." Callum was quiet for another long moment. Then he picked up his glass, drank the last of what was in it, and set it down carefully. "We're not done with this conversation," he said. "I know," Gideon said, "but we're done with it tonight." Callum looked at him, assessing something, taking a final measure. Then he stood up. His brothers stood with him. Eli caught Gideon's eye as he rose and gave a short, tight nod. Not absolution, not friendship, just acknowledgement. The acknowledgement of a young man who had chosen something in the last 10 minutes that was going to cost him something with his brothers, but had chosen it anyway. Gideon watched them move toward the door. His right hand had never moved from the table. He hadn't reached for the gun once, which was the whole point. Drum appeared from the back of the room. He'd been there, quiet in a corner, watching. He came and stood beside the table. "That went better than I expected," Drum said. "It's not finished," Gideon said. "Callum needs time. He might come back around when he's had time to think about Walsh, or he might decide I'm lying and come back for a different conversation. And if he does, then we deal with it then." He stood, picked up his hat. "But Eli won't let it get that far." Drum looked at him. "The youngest one? He's 19. He's the one who told me about Walsh," Gideon said. "A 19-year-old who'd ridden 400 miles on a revenge errand and told me the name of the man who sent him. That's not a kid who wanted to be here. That's a kid who wanted a reason not to do it." He put the hat on. He got his reason. He walked out into the April night. So, Eliza was still in the kitchen when he went to the hotel. He'd known she would be. He'd told her 10 o'clock, and she'd told him she'd do no such thing as close early, and he'd believed her completely. She was at the work table with the ledger again, or possibly still. He wasn't sure if she'd moved since that afternoon. The kitchen was clean and banked, the last of the dinner service long since finished, and the quiet in the room had the particular quality of a space that had been full and active and was now resting. She looked up, read his face the way she always did. "You're all right," she said. "I'm all right." She set the pencil down and looked at him fully for a moment, taking inventory of him the way she took inventory of a pantry, checking what was actually there against what she'd expected. Then she nodded once, apparently satisfied. "Sit down," she said. "There's broth left from service." He sat down on the stool at the end of the work table. She went to the back of the stove and ladled something into a tin cup and set it in front of him. It was the broth. The one Whitfield had put in 4 newspapers, the one he'd tasted for the first time in a boarding house kitchen and hadn't been able to fully describe. She made a version of it every service. He'd had it maybe a dozen times now. It still tasted like the first time. He held the cup in both hands and let the warmth come through his palms, the same way he had 5 months ago on the trail, shaking and frostbitten and not sure if he was going to make the next hour. "There was a man named Walsh," he said. He told her what Eli had said. All of it. The setup, the 400 miles, the way a grieving family had been pointed at a face and given a story that made their grief into an errand. She listened without interruption. "What happens to Walsh?" she said when he was done. "I'll wire the federal office tomorrow." "What he did? Using civilians to carry out what amounts to a hired threat? There's law that covers that." He paused. "It won't be quick, but it'll happen." "And the brothers?" "Callum needs time. Ren will follow Callum. Eli—" He thought about the youngest one's face in the saloon. "Eli's going to be all right. He made a hard call tonight in front of his brothers, and he didn't flinch from it." Eliza was quiet for a moment. Then, "How do you feel?" The question was simple and direct, the way she asked everything, and it caught him slightly off guard because nobody in his professional life had ever asked him that after something like this. They'd asked what happened and what he was going to do next, and whether everyone was accounted for. Not how he felt. He thought about it honestly. "Like something came to a head that's been building for 4 years," he said. "And it didn't end the way those things usually end. Is that good?" "Yes," he said. "That's good." She looked at him across the work table with an expression that was quiet and warm in the specific way of a person who has run long on reserve and is finally in a place where they don't have to. Not soft. Eliza Hartwell was not a soft person, and he didn't think she ever had been. But something close to at ease, which from her was more than most people managed. "You should have said something earlier," she said. Not accusatory, just observational. "Said what?" "Any of it. The October thing. The Powder River. All of it." She held his gaze. "You carried it the whole trail and never said a word about why you were in that snowdrift." "You didn't ask." "I'm asking now." He looked at the cup in his hands, then up at her. So he told her. Not everything. Not the full technical detail of the Powder River action, not the specific sequence of calls and miscalculations that had led to a barn in November and 2 young deputies who hadn't come back out. But the shape of it, the weight of it, the specific quality of carrying the certainty that you'd been right and having it turn out to be the thing that cost people their lives. She listened the way she always listened, complete and still and without the particular performance of sympathy that actually meant nothing. When he finished, she was quiet for a while. "You made a wrong call," she said. "Yes. And you've been carrying it like it makes you someone who doesn't deserve to be here." He didn't answer, which was an answer. "It doesn't," she said. "Making a wrong call that costs something is the worst thing I can imagine," she said. "And it doesn't make you someone who forfeits the rest of his life." She paused. "It makes you someone who made a wrong call. Those are different." Gideon looked at her. "You told me something like that in February," he said. "On the trail, about deserving to be somewhere." "I remember. It didn't fully land then." "I know," she said. "Things don't always land when you say them. Sometimes they land later." She picked up the pencil and looked at the ledger, which meant the conversation was moving into its next phase, which with Eliza meant, the serious thing has been said, it stands. We go on now. Finish the broth. He finished the broth. Outside the hotel kitchen window, Harlan's Fork was quiet in the late April dark. The saloons winding down, the last of the wagon traffic stilled, the framework of the town in its new configuration, still raw in places, still finding its final shape. Gideon set the empty cup on the work table. He thought about Eli Crail riding 400 miles and choosing, at the last moment, not to become the thing he'd been pointed toward. He thought about Walsh and what was coming for him from the federal wire. He thought about October, which was still there but sat differently tonight, less like an indictment and more like something he had to carry the way people carry things, because that was the only honest thing to do with it. He thought about February, about crawling 40 feet. Eliza, he said. She looked up from the ledger. There were things he could say. There were probably a dozen right ways to begin the thing that needed to begin. The conversation that had been building since a woman in a pine bark coat had stood 8 feet from a dying man in the snow and offered him a fire instead of a hand. He didn't say any of the dozen right ways. The broth is better than the first time, he said. I didn't think that was possible. She looked at him for a moment with an expression that was doing several things at once. It's the same recipe, she said. I know, he said. That's not why it's better. She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she looked back down at the ledger, but the corner of her mouth was doing the thing it did. That small, real, briefly visible thing. Go home, Gideon, she said. It's late. He went home, but he took his time getting there. The wire Gideon sent to the federal marshal's office in Helena on a Thursday morning in late April came back with a response by Saturday afternoon, which was faster than he'd expected, and told him the name Fletcher Walsh was not unknown to the people on the other end of the line. The responding wire was terse in the way federal communications always were, compressed to the essential, stripped of anything that didn't need to be said. What it said was enough. Walsh had been under peripheral surveillance since the Powder River inquiry had closed without charges 4 years prior. There had been 2 subsequent complaints from territorial land offices in Wyoming and Dakota that hadn't risen to the level of federal action individually. The combination of those complaints with a documented attempt to incite civilian violence against a federal officer, which was how the law categorized what Walsh had done with the Crail brothers, was enough to open a proper case. An agent would be dispatched. Walsh would be located. Gideon filed the wire in the marshal's office desk and went back to his rounds. He didn't feel the particular satisfaction he might have expected from that. Walsh being caught up in federal process was the right outcome, but it was a distant, procedural kind of justice, the kind that happened in offices and on paper, far from the specific damage the man had done. It wouldn't give Cade Crail his 2 years back. It wouldn't undo the 400 miles the brothers had ridden on a manufactured errand. It would, at minimum, stop Walsh from doing the same thing to someone else. And that was worth something. That was what justice usually was, in Gideon's experience. Not satisfaction, just the stopping of further damage. Callum Crail came to the marshal's office on a Monday morning, alone. He sat down across from Gideon's desk without being invited, which Gideon took as a reasonable sign. A man who was going to do something violent didn't sit down first. He was still hard-faced and still carrying the particular compressed anger that seemed to be his natural register, but something in it had shifted over the 2 weeks since the saloon. The certainty was different, less solid. I wired Helena, Callum said. I know, they told me. Callum looked at him steadily. The records are what you said they were. Gideon didn't respond to that beyond a nod. Our father's heart. He stopped, started again. The coroner's notes said months, that he'd been failing for months before the arrest. His jaw moved. Walsh told us the transport conditions killed him. Neglect. Walsh needed a story that pointed away from himself, Gideon said. Your father's death was already real. Walsh just gave it a direction. Callum was quiet for a long moment. The marshal's office was small and smelled of wood dust and gun oil, and the particular staleness of a room where paperwork accumulated. Outside, the street sounds of Harlan's Fork came through the window. Wagons, voices, the distant hammering that had become the town's permanent background note as it continued building itself outward. Wren is having trouble with it, Callum said finally. He rode 400 miles with a picture in his head of how this was going to go. Changing that picture is... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. That kind of ride takes something out of a man, Gideon said, even when the thing you were riding toward turns out to be wrong. Especially then. Callum looked at the desk between them. Eli's fine. You probably already figured that. I had a sense. He said Walsh was lying before we were halfway here. Said he had a feeling. I told him to keep quiet. Callum's expression moved through something briefly. Regret, maybe. Or the older brother's particular difficulty of being wrong in front of someone younger. He kept quiet. Gideon looked at him. Eli's got good instincts, he said. Worth listening to. Callum almost said something sharp to that, then didn't. Walsh is going to be picked up? Federal agent is en route. It'll take time to build the full case, but yes, he'll answer for it. Another silence. Callum turned his hat in his hands, a restless, mechanical movement that he probably wasn't aware of. I'm not going to say I'm sorry for coming here, Callum said. I'm not built for that kind of talk. I'm not asking for it. I'm saying... He stopped, tried again. I had a right to my grief. Walsh used it. Those are two different things. He looked up from the hat. The grief was real. The errand was wrong. It was, Gideon thought, a harder thing to say than an apology. An apology was a form. It had a shape people knew, a way to receive it. What Callum was saying had no form. It was just a man sitting across a desk trying to be honest about the difference between what was true and what he'd been told, and not having a clean way to do it. I know, Gideon said. I know the difference. Callum stood, put his hat on. He was at the door when Gideon said, Your brother Cade, the one who did the time. Where is he now? Callum turned. Still in Powder River country, small place. He doesn't move around much anymore. There are a lot of towns building out right now. Railroad work, construction, hotel work, steady wages, no questions asked about what came before. He held Callum's eyes. If he wants it, there's work in Harlan's Fork. Tell him to ask for Drum at the marshal's office. I'll leave a word. Callum looked at him for a moment with an expression that was difficult to read and probably was several things at once. Then he nodded, once, and left. Gideon sat alone in the office for a few minutes after the door closed. He wasn't sure Cade Crail would come. He wasn't sure Callum would even pass the message along. But it was the thing he could do that was actual rather than procedural, and he'd learned over the last several months to prefer actual. 2. May arrived with warmth that finally meant it. The snow retreated fully to the high peaks and stayed there. The mud season resolved itself into packed earth that dried to something manageable, and the main street of Harlan's Fork took on the quality of a place that had graduated from temporary to real. Storefronts got painted. A proper schoolhouse broke ground on the east end of town. The telegraph station expanded. Dorsey the liveryman built a second corral. The Grand Continental settled into its stride. By May, the dining room was running 4 nights a week for dinner and 6 for lunch. And there was a waiting list for Saturday evenings that Greer mentioned to anyone who would listen with barely concealed satisfaction. Eliza had added a 5th staff member to the kitchen, a young woman named Ada who'd arrived in town on the railroad with no particular plan and had knocked on the hotel's service door asking for any kind of work, and had turned out, within 2 weeks of Eliza watching her, to have a natural hand for pastry that Henrietta declared was a talent worth keeping. The kitchen had become something, not a perfect operation. Gideon had heard about the dinner service where the oven temperature dropped unexpectedly in the 3rd course, and Eliza had reconstructed 2 dishes in 11 minutes, while Ruiz held the front of house with explanations that bought just enough time. And he'd heard about the Tuesday where the beef delivery arrived wrong, and she'd rebuilt the entire protein portion of the menu in 2 hours on different ingredients and served it without the dining room knowing anything had changed. Not perfect, but it had a quality of competence that was deeper than smooth. It was the competence of a kitchen that knew what it was doing and knew how to recover when things went wrong, which was a harder thing than never going wrong. Gideon ate there twice a week. In the late afternoon before the dinner service, when the kitchen was accessible and Eliza had a few minutes between prep phases to sit at the end of the work table with whatever needed testing. He'd become, without formal negotiation, her most consistent taster. Not because he had a trained palate, but because, as she'd explained once with characteristic directness, He told her what he actually tasted rather than what he thought she wanted to hear. Most people who taste a dish in progress tell you it's good, she'd said. They're being polite. I need someone who'll tell me if the salt is off by a third of a teaspoon. I don't know if the salt is off by a third of a teaspoon, but you know if something doesn't taste right. That I can do. That's what I need. So that was what he did. He tasted things and told her what he actually thought, and she listened or didn't, depending on whether it was useful, and the conversation went wherever it went from there. It had become one of the steadier things in his week. Those late afternoons in the kitchen, the smell of active cooking, the comfortable working silence between two people who'd learned that not every moment needed filling. He'd moved out of the boarding house in May. He'd found a small place on the north end of town. 2 rooms, a decent stove, a porch that looked out toward the mountains, and he'd started putting work into it with the particular deliberate care of a man who was deciding one small repair at a time that he was going to stay. He dug a garden bed along the south wall. He had no real skill with gardening, and he knew it. He planted it anyway, with seeds from the dry goods store and advice from a man 2 houses down who'd been growing vegetables in Montana for 20 years and found Gideon's inexperience mildly entertaining. The first things came up crooked and too close together, and he thinned them badly, and the old man 2 houses down watched from his fence with the restrained horror of an expert witnessing a preventable mistake. "You're going to lose the carrots," the old man said. "I know," Gideon said. "You could have asked me first." "I know that too." The old man shook his head and went back to his own garden, muttering. The carrots came up anyway, undersized and slightly bitter. Gideon ate them. They were the best thing he'd grown from the ground himself, which admittedly was a bar of exactly 1, but still. He told Eliza about the carrots one afternoon in June. She looked at him with the expression she reserved for things that were both true and slightly absurd. "You brought me a carrot," she said, looking at the small lopsided vegetable he'd set on her work table. "I brought you the best one." She picked it up, examined it with the professional attention she gave all raw ingredients, which in this case produced a short silence that told him everything he needed to know about its objective quality. Then she set it down. "I'll put it in the broth," she said, which was, he understood, the highest honor available. It was a Sunday evening in late June when he asked her, not because he'd planned the specific evening. He hadn't. It wasn't the kind of thing he was good at planning, the formal architecture of an occasion. What happened was that they'd been walking back from the river, where they sometimes went on Sunday afternoons when she wasn't working and he wasn't on duty, following a path along the bank where the cottonwoods were coming into their summer fullness and the water ran clear and cold from the mountains. It was the kind of evening that didn't require commentary, warm enough to be comfortable, the sky doing something specific with the light, the town audible in the distance but not present. They'd been talking about Caleb and Martin Foss, the brothers they'd brought into Harlan's Fork in the wagon back in February. Caleb had found work at the construction site and was doing well enough that he'd sent for his wife back in Greeley's Hollow. Martin, the younger one, had taken a job at the livery and was apparently Dorsey's most reliable hand, which from Dorsey was a statement approaching reverence. "You think about them sometimes?" Eliza said. Not a question. She'd noticed. "Not often," he said. "But sometimes. That morning in the trees, the way the kid looked when you told him to get up on the wagon." He paused, like he couldn't quite believe it was real. "It almost wasn't," she said. "If you'd read them as a threat, I almost did. But you didn't." He thought about that, about the specific quality of judgment that was required to look at a scared, hungry kid in the trees and see the scared, hungry kid instead of the potential threat. He hadn't always been good at that. He'd gotten better at it, maybe, or maybe the winter and the snow had done something to his ability to read the basic human condition when he saw it. They walked a little further. The river made its sound, the particular language of moving water over smooth stone, which was one of the few sounds in the world that didn't need any translation. "I've been thinking about the house," he said. Eliza glanced at him. "The north side needs work before winter. I've been putting it off because it seemed—" He paused, looking for the honest word. "It seemed like a lot of effort for a place I wasn't sure I was going to stay in long enough to justify it." She was quiet. "I'm sure now," he said. "I'm staying." He looked at the river. "I've been thinking I'd like to stay with you." The cottonwood leaves did something in the light wind off the water. Somewhere downstream, a bird called twice and stopped. Eliza walked 3 more paces. Then she stopped. He stopped beside her. She turned and looked at him in the full direct way she had. The same way she'd looked at him across a campfire in February when he told her about the deputies, the same way she'd looked at a kitchen she'd just been hired to run, measuring the actual dimensions of a thing against the idea of it. "That's not a very romantic proposal," she said. "No," he agreed. "It isn't." "You could have planned something." "Could have." "You didn't." "No." She held his gaze for another moment. He didn't embellish it or apologize for its plainness, because the plainness of it was the honest thing, and she was a person who preferred honest to decorated. "Yes," she said. He let out a breath he hadn't quite known he'd been holding. "But you need to fix the north side of that house before you ask me to spend a winter in it," she said, already turning back toward the path. "I've had enough cold." "That's fair," he said. "And I need the kitchen to be in a place where Ruiz can run a service without me for 1 evening a week. That'll take another month." "Also fair." And she stopped, looked at him sidelong. "That carrot is not going in the broth. I said that to be kind." He almost laughed. It came out as something close to it, a sound he didn't make often enough that it felt slightly unfamiliar in his chest. "I know," he said. "It was a bad carrot. It was a terrible carrot. The garden is a work in progress." "Everything worth having is," she said. They walked back toward town in the long evening light, which had gone golden the way summer evenings do in high country Montana. Everything warm-edged and specific, the mountains catching the last of it above the tree line in a way that made the distance feel like a painting of itself. Gideon walked beside her and didn't try to make it more than what it was, because what it was already enough. The north side of the house got fixed in July. Gideon did most of it himself badly, and then accepted help from the old man with the garden 2 doors down, who turned out to have been a carpenter before he'd been a gardener, and who supervised the structural work with the same pained expertise he'd brought to watching the carrots. "You've got no business building things," the old man said. "I'm learning," Gideon said. "You're learning expensively." Most things worth knowing cost something. The old man looked at him for a moment, then handed him the hammer and showed him the right angle for the second time. Eliza moved in on the 1st of September. She brought less than he'd expected, which, given what he knew about her, wasn't a surprise. A trunk. A crate of kitchen equipment that she explained was hers personally and not the hotel's, with a specificity that suggested this boundary had been negotiated. A wooden box of books. He hadn't known about the books. And Agnes, who came to live in the small paddock behind the property that Gideon had built over the summer with the old man's supervision and only 2 significant structural errors. The first evening she spent in the house, she cooked in the kitchen, which was modest by any standard and primitive by hers, and produced something out of it that made the room smell like warmth made physical. She didn't comment on the kitchen's limitations. She worked with what was there, the way she always did. He watched her from the doorway and felt something he didn't have a precise name for. Not happiness exactly, or not only that. More like the specific sensation of being in the right place at the right time, which was rarer than it sounded and more valuable than anything he'd ever been paid for a job. "Stop watching me," she said, without turning around. "I'm not watching you. I'm standing in my own doorway." "You've been standing in that doorway for 10 minutes. It's a good doorway." She turned and looked at him with that expression, the one that was doing several things at once. Then she handed him a wooden spoon. "Make yourself useful," she said. He came into the kitchen. The year that followed was not easy in the way that nothing is easy. Gideon had 2 situations that winter that he didn't talk about in detail afterward. A confrontation at the railroad camp in November that left him with a broken finger and a 2-week headache, and a missing person case in December that ended badly in the way that missing person cases sometimes did, and that he carried quietly in the particular internal space where he kept the things he couldn't fix. Drum noticed both without commenting directly, which was the correct response. Eliza had her own version of hard. The hotel expanded in the spring, which meant the kitchen had to scale up faster than was comfortable. And there was a period in March and April where she was working 15-hour days and coming home exhausted, in a way she didn't fully admit, but that showed in how she held her shoulders and how long it took her to unwind in the evenings. Henrietta had a health scare in February that turned out to be less serious than the week between the first symptom and the doctor's verdict suggested, and the kitchen ran ragged without her for those 10 days before the news was good. They had arguments. Not many, but real ones. The kind that come when two people who are both used to operating alone bump into the edges of shared space. An argument in October about whether Gideon had the right to make a financial decision about the property without asking her, which he had and didn't, and which they worked out over 3 days that were tense in the specific way of two people who are both right about part of something and wrong about the rest. An argument in spring about something smaller that was actually about the larger thing of how much either of them was willing to ask for help when they needed it, which was a conversation they'd been having in one form or another since February in a snowdrift, and which probably wasn't fully resolved so much as continuously negotiated. They were not a smooth operation. They were two people who had both been largely on their own for a long time, learning how not to be, which was harder than it looked from the outside. But the thing that mattered was that they stayed in it. That when the argument was done, they came back to the table, literally sometimes, Eliza's work table in the kitchen, which had become the place where the real conversations happened. They came back, and they talked, and they didn't let the difficulty calcify into distance, which was what happened when people stopped doing the work of it. Cade Crail came to Harlan's Fork in the spring, the way Gideon had hoped but hadn't counted on. He was thin and quiet, with the particular quality of a man who had been somewhere that changed the dimensions of how he occupied space. He found Drum at the marshal's office, as instructed, and Drum pointed him toward the hotel construction project that was adding a west wing. He worked quietly and reliably and kept to himself in the way of men who need time to find their footing in a place. Gideon gave him room. They spoke twice in the first month, brief, factual exchanges that carried more weight underneath than their surfaces showed. By summer, Cade had a room above the dry goods store, and a position as a senior laborer on the construction crew, and a habit of eating Saturday lunch at the Grand Continental, where he'd sit alone and eat the hotel food with the specific concentration of someone who was rebuilding a relationship with ordinary pleasures. Eli Crail wrote a letter that arrived in August. It was short. Eli turned out to be a man of fewer words on paper than in person. He was working a horse ranch in Wyoming and was doing all right. He said he thought about the night in the saloon sometimes. He said he didn't regret it. He said he hoped Gideon would pass along to the cook. He'd heard about the hotel in the newspaper columns, apparently, that the broth sounded like something worth riding 400 miles for on its own merits. Gideon read the letter to Eliza at the work table. She was quiet for a moment when he finished. Then she said, "Tell him if he's ever in the territory, there's a bowl with his name on it." Gideon wrote back. He said exactly that. It was a Sunday morning in September, almost 2 years exactly from when Eliza had moved in, when they sat on the porch before the day started. The mountains were doing what they did in early September, the upper elevations showing the first faint blush of color change while the lower country was still fully summer. The air had that particular quality of a morning that hasn't decided yet whether it wants to be warm or cool and is offering both at once. Eliza had a cup of coffee and the weekly supply list for the hotel, which she worked through with her pencil even on Sunday mornings because a kitchen that size didn't stop needing management because the calendar said rest. Gideon had coffee and nothing else, which was a thing he was still learning. The art of sitting still without needing to be doing something, which didn't come naturally to him, and probably never fully would. They'd been talking about Caleb Foss, whose wife had had a baby in July and had named the boy after an uncle, which Caleb had mentioned to Gideon in the same casual way he mentioned everything, as if none of it was remarkable when all of it was. "He was going to freeze to death in those trees," Gideon said. "He was going to do something inadvisable," Eliza agreed. "He had a rifle in poor judgment and no food. And you put him on the wagon." "You found him," she said. "I just had the wagon." He looked at her. "You know what I think about when I think about the trail." She glanced up from the list. "I think about 40 feet of snow," he said. "I think about the fact that you could have walked past me. You were traveling alone and I was dead weight, and you had a destination and a timeline and no reason to stop." "I had a reason." "You didn't know me." "I knew enough," she said. "I knew you weren't going to die in the snow like a dog if I gave you a choice about it. The rest I figured out on the road." He sat with that for a moment, The thing about that 40 feet was that he'd thought about it a lot over 2 years, not with the grinding weight that October still carried, but with a different quality, a wondering quality, about what it cost to drag yourself forward when every part of you wanted to stop, about what it meant that the choice had been given to him rather than made for him, that she'd stood there and let him decide, which was the only way it could have worked, because a man being carried to a fire against his will is not a man choosing to live. He had to choose it himself. She'd just made it possible to choose. He thought that was probably the truest thing he'd learned in the last 2 years, and he'd come to it from 40 feet of snow, which was an expensive classroom, but an effective one. "I'm glad you stopped," he said. She looked at him with the quiet directness that was her natural register, steady and clear and without decoration. "So am I," she said. She went back to the supply list. He went back to his coffee and the mountains and the particular quality of a morning that had everything it needed in it already. There is a version of this story that ends with a list of things. The years Gideon served as Marshal of Harlan's Fork, the expansion of the Grand Continental, the second and then the third newspaper column about Eliza's kitchen, the house that grew a second room, and then a garden that eventually, under someone more competent than Gideon's first attempts, produced things worth eating. The Whitfield piece ran in 8 papers by 1882. Cade Crail stayed. Drum made county sheriff and asked Gideon to take the marshal's position full, which he did. But the version that matters isn't the accumulation. The accumulation is just time passing, which happens to everyone. What matters is smaller and harder to measure. It's a man who spent 6 months trying to walk himself to the edge of his own story, discovering that the story wasn't over. It's a woman who traveled 211 miles through February weather towards something most people told her she couldn't have, and arrived at it not because the world suddenly became fair, but because she refused to accept its version of her limits as the final word. It's the specific courage required to do the thing you know is right when the easier thing is so clearly available. Eli Crail in a saloon with his brothers watching, choosing to say the name. Callum Crail with his hand near his belt, deciding not to use it. A woman who could have cooked an Eastern menu for an Eastern audience and gave them the frontier instead. None of these people were exceptional in the way that stories sometimes pretend people are. They didn't have special gifts that made the hard thing easy. They were ordinary people in difficult circumstances who made one specific right choice at one specific hard moment, and that choice compounded forward into something that looked, from a distance, like a life well lived. That's all it ever is. One choice, made when it cost something. Gideon Hale, who had crawled 40 feet through a Montana snowstorm to a stranger's fire, understood this better than most by the time the story was done. He'd been a man who thought the worst thing about making the wrong call was that it proved something permanent about who you were. He'd learned, slowly, imperfectly, at considerable personal expense, that it proved nothing of the kind. It proved only that you had made a wrong call, which was a thing that could be carried and could be learned from and could eventually be set down, not forgotten, but no longer load-bearing. He'd learned it from 40 feet of snow and a woman who gave him the choice instead of the rescue. And Eliza Hartwell, who had come west with a trunk and a wagon and a cast-iron pot and the kind of certainty that lives deeper than confidence, built the thing she'd set out to build. Not because anyone helped her, but because she never asked for the kind of help that would have required her to make herself smaller in exchange for it. She asked for the chance to show what she was. And when she got it, she used it. The frontier had a way of telling people what they were. The cold, the distance, the difficulty. It stripped things down to what held and what didn't. Some people let that define them. Some people decided it was information, not verdict. The man who crawled through the snow learned how to live again. The woman who cooked for the land itself instead of the audience changed what a room of people thought was possible. And somewhere between those two things, between survival and purpose, between what you've done and what you do next, there is a life that is neither perfect nor uncomplicated, but is, without question, worth having. That's not nothing. In the end, that's almost everything.